So right after I posted yesterday's video diving into just how truly fucking awful some of the ECU mapping is out there on the market, specifically on that ZX6 ECU we saw yesterday, I rolled this bike up here on the dyno for an appointment. And this must be some sort of divine intervention, because this bike right behind me isn't exactly the same scenario, except worse, than the ZX6 ECU that we just dove into yesterday. So this bike rolled on in already built by a local dealer, and this guy spent some serious money. It's got some pretty high quality suspension installed, it's got a nice set of pipes, underneath the cam chest and the air cleaner what you can't see is an aftermarket set of cams, lifters, and push rods, and effectively it is Harley's Stage 2 build when you're talking about these new Milwaukee 8 engines. And just like the guy that sent us that ZX6 ECU yesterday that he was super unhappy with, this gentleman drank the same Kool-Aid. It's not from the same tuner, but it's the same story. This is our nice hot baseline when we rolled this bike in yesterday. Run 2 makes 99 horsepower, 120, 121 pound-feet of torque. And there has been obviously some tuning done here at wide open throttle. You know, it's maybe 10% too lean right off the bottom there at 2,000 RPMs. It's maybe 8 or 9% too rich there at 4 to 4,500 RPMs, but it's decently close-ish at wide open throttle. Now, if that's all you're seeing, which is what really all you see on the internet, whether it's social media or some tuner's website, you're looking at a wide open throttle dyno graph. That's where the big performance improvements are, is at wide open throttle. And if you were to overlay that graph, with I just showed you, with how this bike ran stock, then you would say, yeah, that guy must know what he's doing. That's a pretty huge improvement. But it couldn't be further from the truth. Because if you're honest with yourself for a second, how often are you actually riding your Harley like this, on the throttle stop? It's virtually never. The vast majority of the time, 99% of the time, you're somewhere here in the mid-throttle range, or just cruising along at about 10%. If you really take your ego out of the equation for a second, guys, and ask yourself how many times you're ever actually sitting here on the throttle stop for maybe more than 2 seconds while you're fucking around with your buddies from light to light, it's virtually never. In fact, even the highest caliber riders in this country at Moto America, the guys in the Super Sports series, are not on the throttle stop. They're not at 100% throttle, even half the time when they're racing somewhere like the Ridge Motorsports Park just over here in Shelton, Washington. I had a rough idea of what the exact percentage of time on that track was at wide open throttle, but I didn't want to give out any inaccurate information, so I went ahead and shot my buddy Ken Hill a text message this morning. If you don't know Ken, he is one of the most well-known and highly regarded racing coaches in this country, and the guy just pours over data nonstop. So I knew he would have an exact answer for me, and shout out and thank you to Ken for getting me the exact figure. It's 32.2% of the time. The fastest riders in this country on a purpose-built super sport race bike are only at wide open throttle 32.2% of the time. So if you're on something like a Harley Davidson, why in the world would you ever be judging a tuner's quality based on a wide open throttle dyno graph when that's never where you're at? Now, guys, I get it. I'm guilty of it too. When you're advertising performance improvements, all you really want to see is wide open throttle. That's where all the power's made, right? That's where most of the modern motorcycles are heavily restricted. So that's where you're going to see the big gains. They're fun to look at. They're cool. Watching full throttle dyno passes is amusing, but it just doesn't tell you the whole story, not by a mile. So let's get back to why I want to focus on this bike specifically. This guy came on in, the bike ran pretty decently well at wide open throttle, but he kept getting a ton of different fault codes popping up because these Harleys are pretty darn sensitive ECUs compared to the rest of the other stuff that's used on the Japanese and European side of the market, surprisingly, and it knows when something's fucked up. In fact, when I ran this bike for the first time yesterday, the amount of carbon that blew out of this pipe literally filled my whole dyno room here. I have 2 grain silo fans to vent this motherfucker, and I had to actually stop and step out of the room because I couldn't even see my screen 3 feet in front of me. In fact, the mapping in this bike was so fucked. It was so unbelievably rich through almost the entire throttle range that when we were done tuning it, I went ahead just for fun and took a look at the oil in the bike, and there was a layer about this thick of just straight gasoline sitting in the crankcase from all of the unburnt fuel that blew past the rings and just settled down in there with the oil. And in case you weren't aware, gasoline isn't a great lubricant. Now, luckily, I don't think this guy rode it around that way with that much fuel in the crankcase long enough to really hurt anything, but that's besides the point. The tuner that provided this quality of work should be absolutely ashamed of themselves for ever letting something like this roll out their door. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and share with you guys something I normally don't go ahead and advertise, which is the exact values that we have in this ECU. Now, luckily, this is just a trim table, so this isn't specific values that anybody can rip off for the tuning that we went ahead and provided to this customer, but it does highlight something really important to look at. This is the percentage of fuel that I've had to either add or remove based on TPS and RPM. This is the rear cylinder of this bike, and you can see right here at 10% throttle, where you spend most of your time riding one of these Harley Davidsons, right at cruise, between 2,500, 3,000 RPMs, I've had to pull away 40% of the fuel mapping that this fucking clown had in this guy's ECU. 40% in a trim table for fuel is fucking enormous. There aren't many bikes that you have to crank 40% more fuel into to get them perform properly. And the only way that this happens is when a tuner is just globally adding fuel based on what they see at wide open throttle on a dyno. They didn't even once take a second to look at how the bike was running anywhere else, let alone actually go through the process of building proper mapping and doing a log pass and adjusting the fueling at every one of those throttle percentages you saw in that table. So 5%, 10%, 15, 20, 40, 60, 80, all the way out to 100. That's the way you do it properly. But that's not what anybody ever does anymore in this industry. They just went ahead and advertise a wide open throttle dyno graph and to take your money. If we go back to the delta table here, I flipped it over to the front cylinder. Because you can see here that even at idle, just sitting there idling on the dyno, this guy should have seen that the bike was idling 30% richer than it needed to. Again, we're talking like a 14-to-1 air fuel target. It's nothing outlandish. So when you're talking about 30% in addition to that, that puts the fueling at around 11-to-1 AFR. That will foul plugs just sitting there idling. And to those of you that might chime in on this video, and those of you that definitely chimed in yesterday saying, well, at least at wide open throttle they got tuning, shut the fuck up. They're not even any good at tuning these bikes at wide open throttle. Because after we got done overhauling all of the mapping in this ECU with proper custom built individual cylinder specific fuel and ignition timing, guess what? It still picked up 6 horsepower and 7 foot-pounds of torque literally everywhere. Listen guys, these are not isolated incidents. This isn't a rare thing that happens. I see this every single day. Hand on my heart, God's honest truth. I either get a phone call, email, or somebody sends us an ECU or brings us a bike every single day. We're open here at 2 Old Dyno Works that it has already been tuned or flashed by someone else and it's fucked. Nobody ever talks about it because nobody wants to be just shot down by any of those big name popular social media celebrity tuners out there. I don't care if they're on YouTube or Instagram or Facebook or whatever. People are afraid of speaking out and I am absolutely fucking sick of it. Because the sad reality is that most tuners out there offering large scale, what I call mainstream tuning for the masses, are clowns. They do not know what the hell they're doing. They're passing off a pretty wide open throttle dyno graph and doing nothing else. When again, you're riding the bike the vast majority of the time everywhere else but wide open throttle. Here, actually, hang on a second. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Because I've got another ECU right out there from yesterday that was sent in the exact same scenario from the one that we talked about previously. And just like this bike, the tuner clearly never did shit at anywhere else other than wide open throttle. It's actually laughable. Come here. Just to highlight what I'm talking about here, here is another note from a customer that sent in an ECU. I've got the other half of it folded back because they actually sent in 2 ECUs, and on this note is the other tuner that originally flashed this thing that this guy is pissed off at. Now, if you read that note, it very clearly said, stock headers, cat delete slip-on, on a Ninja 1000. Again, just so there's full transparency here, no bullshit folks, you can see the date that this file was created. That's when I read it yesterday afternoon. I've removed the tuner's name from the very top of the note they left in here because they so proudly advertise who's done this glorious work. You can see that it says a Akrapovic full exhaust, stock air filter, stock pair system. Okay. The pair system, for those of you that don't know, is an air injection system, which means it takes fresh air from the air box, pumps it into the exhaust stream post-combustion, and essentially heats up the catalytic converter to go ahead and allow it to more efficiently burn unburned gases. And if you have a sniffer inside the exhaust to go ahead and measure an air-fuel ratio while this system is active, you'll see nothing but insane lean conditions all over the place that have absolutely nothing to do with the actual combustion of the engine because this emission system is pumping air into it post-combustion. So not only did this tuner go ahead and flash mapping that they had developed for a system that is not what the guy has on the bike into the ECU, but they developed this mapping in a manner, with the air injection system still intact, that makes it 100% impossible to accurately build any sort of custom fuel mapping outside of wide open throttle. Because guess what? The air injection system's only shut off pretty much at wide open throttle, which, as we've just covered, is where you're never actually riding the fucking bike. And if you actually take a look at the TPS table, the fuel mapping in this bike, they didn't even try. Like, they're aware that this system is present, they're aware of what it does, and they just globally added 5% more fuel at 5,000 RPMs or below, and literally touched nothing else. If I can go ahead and scroll down here all the way to the bottom at 11,000 RPMs, where the limiters in these bikes, they didn't do shit. They know it's a problem, so they did nothing. But these people, these tuners out there, are still more than happy to go ahead and pass this stuff off as high quality, well-developed mapping. For all of you purchasing ECU flashing, for those of you spending big bucks on some jackass to go ahead and tune your Harley, so much of it these days is utter shit. It's just a joke. It's people playing practically a shell game because they're going, hey, look at what I developed over here. The rest of my tuning must be really good, right? It's just not. And look, it's hard to avoid it because these guys have invaded pretty much every corner of the motorsports industry. It's just as bad, if not worse, on the automotive side. But you just have to ask questions and do your research and really grill these people with how much experience they've actually got developing mapping for your specific bike. How does their process work? What does it look like? How are they measuring AFR on a dyno? How much time do they spend developing the full throttle mapping versus the part throttle mapping? What AFR targets are they using at part throttle versus full throttle? Just question them, because I guarantee the further you grill them, the more it will become very apparent that all of a sudden they don't have snap instant answers off the top of your head to your questions, which means they're full of shit. Those of us going through the process properly to develop custom ECU mapping for the models that we support don't have to sit there and go, we've done it enough times that we just know the answers off the top of our head. I'm not saying this to make me seem like I'm some sort of tuning god and the only guy out there that can do this right. But the sad reality is, I'm probably one of what I would consider a handful of people in the country that do actually do it the right way. So please, again, just question these guys, do your research, because if you don't, you can unfortunately end up like this guy. And if he had just believed the tuner that he had talked to that said, oh, that's just the way these things are, it's totally fine, go ride it. Well, fuel is not a great lubricant, and eventually this guy would have tossed the crank in this bike. Now, as for us specifically, here at Tool Dynoworks, I've covered our R&D process at length dozens of times. I've got a very lengthy video describing it on our FAQ. I'll go ahead and link that in the description below. But please, if you ever have any questions whatsoever about getting your bike properly tuned and dialed in, whether it is a Harley with a built engine that we're gonna have to tune on the dyno for you here, or it is a aftermarket intake and exhaust system on a Japanese European sport bike, doesn't matter what the platform is. Feel free to ask. I am more than happy to answer any of your questions. I answer all of our tech support emails myself every single day, and we will happily help you get your bike properly tuned and dialed in the first time.